A crowded military base cafeteria, the kind where conversations buzz like static electricity and the smell of institutional coffee mingles with tension. It's Fort Bragg, North Carolina, 2019, and Staff Sergeant Maria Santos is sitting alone. At a corner table, methodically eating her lunch while reviewing training schedules on her tablet. She's small in stature, barely 5'4", with dark hair pulled back in regulation, style and eyes that seem to take in everything without appearing to look at anything in particular. To most people passing by, she's just another service member grabbing a quick meal between duties. But Maria Santos carries secrets that would make even the most hardened soldiers pause in respect. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The trouble started when Colonel Richard Hawthorne entered the cafeteria. At 6'2", with a chest full of ribbons and a reputation for being what some called old school military, Hawthorne commanded attention wherever he went. He'd earned his rank through decades of service, but somewhere along the way, he'd also developed an attitude problem, particularly when it came to women in the military. He believed, despite all evidence to the contrary, that combat roles should remain a man's domain, and he wasn't shy about expressing those views. Hawthorne's eyes swept the cafeteria until they landed on Maria. He'd been hearing whispers about her lately, something about her being assigned to train some of his soldiers in advanced combat techniques. The very idea irritated him. Here was this diminutive woman, probably in her early 30s, and somehow she'd been deemed qualified to teach his battle-tested men. It didn't sit right with him, not one bit. Maria sensed his approach before she saw him. It's a skill you develop when you've spent years in situations where situational awareness can mean the difference between life and death. She looked up as his shadow fell across her table, noting the way his jaw was set, the particular gleam in his eyes that suggested he was spoiling for a confrontation. "Staff Sergeant Santos, I presume," Hawthorne said, his voice carrying that particular tone that officers use when they're about to dress someone down. "I understand you're supposed to be training some of my men in combat techniques." Maria set down her fork and gave him her full attention. "Yes, sir. I'm scheduled to begin the Advanced Close Quarters Combat course next Monday." Hawthorne laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Advanced Close Quarters Combat. From you," he made a show of looking her up and down, his expression making it clear he found the concept ridiculous. "Tell me, Staff Sergeant, exactly what qualifications do you think you have to teach my soldiers anything about real combat?" The cafeteria around them began to quiet as other service members picked up on the tension. Maria remained seated, her posture relaxed, her voice steady. "Sir, I have the qualifications deemed necessary by command to conduct this training." "That's not what I asked," Hawthorne pressed, stepping closer to her table. "I asked what makes you think you can teach men who've seen real action, who've been in actual firefights, anything they don't already know. You look like you'd blow away in a strong wind." Maria could feel the eyes of dozens of other service members on them now. This was exactly the kind of situation she'd learned to navigate carefully over the years. She could shut this down in about 30 seconds if she wanted to, but that would create more problems than it would solve. Better to let Colonel Hawthorne dig his own hole a little deeper first. "I understand your concerns, sir," she replied calmly. "If you'd like to review my service record or speak with my commanding officer about the training curriculum, your service record," Hawthorne interrupted with another dismissive laugh. "Let me guess, you've been pushing papers in some air-conditioned office. Maybe ran a few training exercises in controlled environments. That's not the same as real combat, sweetheart." The word sweetheart hung in the air like a challenge. Maria's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes, a flicker of something that, if Hawthorne had been more observant, might have given him pause. "Sir, I assure you that my experience extends beyond administrative duties. Maria said, her voice remaining perfectly level. I'm sure it does, Hawthorne replied sarcastically. Tell you what, Staff Sergeant. Why don't you prove to me right? Now that you're qualified to teach my men anything, show me what you've got. The cafeteria had gone almost completely silent now. Even the kitchen staff had stopped their clattering to watch the confrontation unfold. Maria slowly stood up, and despite her small stature, there was something about the way she moved that suggested coiled power, like a spring under tension. I don't think that's necessary, sir, she said. Oh, but I do, Hawthorne pressed, emboldened by what he perceived as her reluctance. In fact, I'm making it in order. Show these men what kind of advanced combat techniques you think you can. Teach them. Maria looked around the now silent cafeteria, taking in the faces of the dozens of service members who had stopped eating to watch this confrontation unfold. Some looked uncomfortable with the colonel's behavior. Others seemed curious about how this small woman would handle being challenged so publicly by a superior officer. She recognized a few faces soldiers she'd worked with before who were trying to keep their expressions neutral, probably knowing more about her background than they could safely reveal in this moment. Colonel Hawthorne, Maria said carefully, with respect, I don't think a cafeteria demonstration would be appropriate or safe for. Are you refusing a direct order, Staff Sergeant? Hawthorne cut her off, his voice rising just enough to carry to every corner of the room. He was playing to the crowd now, confident that he had her backed into a corner. Because that's what this sounds like to me. Maria paused, recognizing the trap he was trying to set. If she refused, he could write her up for insubordination. If she agreed, she'd either have to hold back making herself look incompetent or demonstrate skills that might raise questions she wasn't ready to answer. Either way, Hawthorne thought he had her exactly where he wanted her. What Colonel Hawthorne didn't know was that Maria Santos had been in far more dangerous situations than a cafeteria confrontation with an arrogant officer. She'd spent the last 8 years of her military career in places that didn't officially exist, doing things that would never appear in any public record. She'd learned to think 3 moves ahead in situations where one wrong decision could get herself and her teammates killed. No, sir, I'm not refusing, Maria replied. I'm simply concerned about conducting any kind of physical demonstration without proper safety protocols. And oh, for crying out loud, Hawthorne interrupted, rolling his eyes dramatically. We're not talking about some kind of full contact fight here. Just show us a few of these advanced techniques you think you're qualified to teach. Unless, of course, you're admitting that you're not actually qualified. He was backing her into a corner, and they both knew it. Maria glanced around the room one more time, noting the positions of the tables, the location of the exits, the spacing between herself and the colonel. Old habits died hard. Very well, sir, she said finally. But I'll need a volunteer from among your men to demonstrate with. Hawthorne's grin widened. This was going better than he'd hoped. Sergeant Morrison, he called out to a large man sitting at a nearby table. Come over here and help the staff sergeant with her demonstration. Sergeant Jack Morrison was exactly the kind of soldier Hawthorne loved. 6'3", built like a linebacker, with hands the size of dinner plates and a reputation for being tough as nails. He'd served 2 tours in Afghanistan and had the kind of presence that made other soldiers step aside when he walked down a hallway. If anyone was going to expose this woman's lack of real combat experience, it would be Morrison. Morrison stood up slowly, clearly uncomfortable with the situation but unable to refuse his colonel's order. As he approached, Maria could see the apology in his eyes. He was a good soldier who didn't like being used as a prop in his superior's power play, but he also wasn't about to disobey a direct order. I'm sorry about this, Staff Sergeant, Morrison murmured as he positioned himself facing her. It's okay, Sergeant, Maria replied quietly. Just follow my lead and nobody gets hurt. Hawthorne clapped his hands together. All right then, let's see what you've got. Show us one of these advanced combat techniques that's going to make my soldiers better fighters. Maria took a deep breath, her mind racing through her options. She could demonstrate something basic, something that would satisfy Hawthorne's demand without revealing too much about her true capabilities. But looking at his smug expression, at the way he was so certain he'd cornered her, she felt a familiar spark of defiance that had gotten her through some of the darkest moments of her career. "The technique I'm going to demonstrate," she announced, her voice carrying clearly through the silent cafeteria, "is designed for situations where you're significantly outmatched in size and strength. The key is using your opponent's momentum and expectations against them." She positioned herself in front of Morrison, who towered over her by more than a foot and outweighed her by at least 80 pounds. To the casual observer, it looked like a mismatch that bordered on the absurd. "Sergeant Morrison," she instructed, "I want you to grab my wrist, just like you would if you were trying to restrain someone resisting arrest or attempting to control a combatant." Morrison hesitated. "Staff Sergeant, I don't want to hurt. You won't hurt me," Maria assured him. "Trust me on that. Just grab my wrist firmly, the way you've been trained." Still looking uncomfortable, Morrison reached out and wrapped his large hand around Maria's right wrist. His grip was firm, but not crushing. He was clearly trying to be careful despite the colonel's obvious expectations. "Good," Maria said. "Now, Colonel, what you're seeing is a very common situation in combat. A smaller defender being physically controlled by a larger attacker. Most people in this situation would try to pull away or struggle against the grip. That's exactly what your attacker expects, and it plays to their strength advantage." Hawthorne nodded, still smirking. "Makes sense. So what's your brilliant solution, Staff Sergeant?" Maria's expression remained neutral, but something shifted in her stance. "The solution is to do exactly what they don't expect." What happened next took less than 3 seconds. Maria's movement was so fluid, so precise, that half the people watching weren't entirely sure what they'd just witnessed. One moment, Sergeant Morrison was gripping her wrist, confident in his size and strength advantage, and the next moment he was on the ground, flat on his back, staring up at the ceiling with a look of complete bewilderment on his face. Maria stood over him, completely composed, not even breathing hard. Morrison's hand was still extended where her wrist had been, but she was no longer there. Instead, she was positioned in such a way that she could have easily transitioned to any number of finishing moves if this had been a real combat situation. "Jesus Christ," someone whispered from across the cafeteria. Morrison pushed himself up on his elbows, shaking his head. "What the hell just happened? Are you hurt, Sergeant?" Maria asked, extending a hand to help him up. "No, I'm fine," Morrison replied, accepting her assistance and getting back to his feet. He rubbed his shoulder where he'd hit the ground and looked at her with newfound respect. "But I have no idea how you just did that." Colonel Hawthorne's smirk had vanished. His mouth was slightly open, and for the first time since entering the cafeteria, he seemed at a loss for words. The technique Maria had just demonstrated wasn't something you learned in basic combat training, or even in most advanced military courses. It was the kind of move that suggested years of specialized training, the kind that came from programs most soldiers had only heard rumors about. "The principle," Maria explained to the room, her voice calm and instructional, "is misdirection combined with leverage and timing. Sergeant Morrison was expecting resistance in one direction, so I gave him acceleration in a completely different direction. His own strength and momentum did most of the work." She turned to face Hawthorne directly. "This technique is particularly effective when dealing with opponents who underestimate you based on your physical appearance. They're so confident in their advantage that they don't properly assess the actual threat level." The words hung in the air, and everyone in the cafeteria understood that she wasn't just talking about combat techniques anymore. Hawthorne's face was reddening. He'd expected to humiliate this woman, to prove his point about female soldiers being unfit for combat roles. Instead, she just demonstrated a level of skill that most of his men couldn't match. But rather than backing down, his embarrassment only made him angrier. "Lucky move," he said dismissively, though his voice lacked the confidence it had carried before. "One parlor trick doesn't make you qualified to train real soldiers." "You're right, sir," Maria agreed. "One demonstration doesn't prove qualification. Would you like to see another?" The challenge in her voice was subtle but unmistakable. Morrison, still rubbing his shoulder, took a step back. He'd felt the controlled power in that throw, had sensed that she'd been holding back significantly. Whatever this woman's background was, it went far beyond anything he'd encountered in conventional military training. "Actually," Hawthorne said, his ego overriding his better judgment, "why don't you demonstrate on me? Let's see how those techniques work against someone who knows they're coming." A murmur ran through the cafeteria. This was escalating beyond what anyone had expected. Several senior NCOs were exchanging glances, clearly wondering if they should intervene before their colonel did something he'd regret. Maria studied Hawthorne for a long moment. At 6'2" and probably 200 pounds, he was even larger. Then Morrison. More importantly, he was an officer her superior in the chain of command. Putting him on the ground, even in a demonstration, would have consequences that went far beyond this moment. "Sir, I don't think that would be appropriate," she said carefully. "Oh, now you're concerned about appropriate." Hawthorne laughed, but it sounded forced. "You just threw one of my sergeants around like a rag doll, but you're worried about appropriateness when it comes to me?" He stepped closer, invading her personal space in a way that was clearly intended to intimidate. "Or maybe you know that your little tricks won't work on someone who's actually been in real combat situations." Maria didn't step back. She'd faced down enemy combatants, had stared death in the face more times than she cared to count. One blustering colonel wasn't going to make her flinch. "Sir, my concern isn't about the effectiveness of the techniques," she replied evenly. "It's about the appropriateness of a staff sergeant physically engaging with a colonel in front of enlisted personnel." "Let me worry about appropriateness," Hawthorne snapped. "I'm giving you a direct order, Staff Sergeant. Demonstrate your technique." On me right now. The cafeteria had gone dead silent again. This had moved beyond a simple confrontation into something that could end careers. Maria realized that Hawthorne had backed himself into a corner just as much as he'd tried to corner her. His ego wouldn't let him back down now, not in front of all these witnesses. She made her decision. "Very well, sir. But I'll need you to remove your jacket first." Hawthorne looked puzzled. "My jacket?" "Why? For your safety, sir. And because the technique I'm going to demonstrate works better when I can get a proper grip on your shirt rather than loose fabric." It was a reasonable request, and Hawthorne nodded curtly as he shrugged out of his dress uniform jacket and handed it to a nearby soldier. Underneath, he wore the standard military undershirt that all soldiers were familiar with. As he turned back to face her, Maria was already moving into position. "Sir, I'm going to need you to grab both of my wrists this time, as if you were trying to restrain me from reaching for a weapon." Hawthorne stepped forward eagerly, clearly confident that his size and experience would be enough to counter whatever she had planned. He reached out and grasped both of her wrists firmly, his large hands easily encircling them. "Ready when you are, Staff Sergeant," he said with renewed confidence. Maria looked up at him, and for just a moment, something flickered in her eyes that should have warned him. But Hawthorne was too focused on proving his point to notice. "Before I begin," Maria said quietly, "I should mention that this particular technique is one I learned during my time with the 75th Ranger Regiment." The effect of those words was immediate and electric. Every person in that cafeteria knew what the 75th Ranger Regiment represented. It was one of the Army's premier special operations units, an elite force that only accepted the absolute best soldiers after grueling selection and training processes, Hawthorne's grip on her wrists loosened slightly. "The Rangers? You're claiming you were a Ranger?" "I'm not claiming anything, sir," Maria replied. "I'm stating a fact. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." The silence that followed Maria's statement was profound. You could have heard a pin drop in that cafeteria. The 75th Ranger Regiment wasn't just another military unit, it was legendary. Rangers were the soldiers other soldiers looked up to, the elite warriors who took on the most dangerous missions behind enemy lines. And here was this unassuming woman claiming to be one of them. Colonel Hawthorne's face had gone pale. His grip on her wrists had loosened considerably, and Maria could see the doubt creeping into his eyes. But his ego was still fighting against the possibility that he'd made a terrible mistake. "You're lying," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Women aren't allowed in the Rangers." "Women weren't officially allowed in Ranger School until 2015, Maria corrected calmly. "But there were always exceptions made for certain specialized positions, particularly for soldiers with specific skill sets that were needed for particular missions." She was being deliberately vague, and everyone in the room understood why. There were aspects of military operations that couldn't be discussed openly, even among service members. But her words carried the ring of truth, the kind of specific knowledge that couldn't be faked. Sergeant Morrison, who had been watching this exchange with growing amazement, suddenly spoke up. "Staff Sergeant Santos, were you part of the group that—" He stopped himself mid-sentence, clearly remembering that he was in mixed company and that some conversations couldn't happen in public. Maria gave him a look that confirmed his suspicions without saying a word. "Holy shit," Morrison whispered, then immediately looked embarrassed for swearing in front of officers. Hawthorne was beginning to realize that he'd stepped into something much bigger than he'd anticipated. The confident bravado that had carried him into this confrontation was evaporating rapidly. But he was in too deep now to back down gracefully. "Prove it," he demanded, though his voice was noticeably less aggressive than before. "If you're really a Ranger, prove it." Maria studied his face for a moment, then made a decision that would change the entire dynamic of the situation. She released herself from his grip, a move so smooth and effortless that it barely registered, and stepped back. "Turn around," she said simply. "What?" "Turn around, sir. Face away from me." Hawthorne looked confused, but the authority in her voice was compelling. Despite his higher rank, there was something about her presence now that made him want to comply. Slowly, he turned his back to her. Maria reached for the hem of her uniform shirt and lifted it slightly, just enough to reveal the lower portion of her back. What she revealed made several people in the cafeteria gasp audibly. There, tattooed in stark black and red across her lower back, was the distinctive Ranger tab, the curved patch that identified members of the 75th Ranger Regiment. But it wasn't just any Ranger tab. This one was surrounded by other symbols that told a story of service that went far beyond what most soldiers would ever experience. Below the Ranger tab was a scroll with the words "Soi Spant," the Ranger motto meaning "of their own accord." Flanking it were jump wings indicating airborne qualification, and beneath that, partially visible, were the crossed arrows of Special Forces qualification. But it was what surrounded these official symbols that really caught the attention of those close enough to see clearly. Small, carefully detailed tattoos that looked like coordinates, dates, and symbols that meant nothing to casual observers, but would be instantly recognizable to anyone who had served in certain capacities. "Jesus Christ," Sergeant Morrison breathed. "She's not just a Ranger. She's Christ. Look at those markings." One of the other soldiers, a staff sergeant who had served multiple deployments, squinted at the tattoos and went pale. Are those kill marks?" Maria let her shirt fall back into place and turned around. The atmosphere in the cafeteria had changed completely. What had started as a confrontation between a blustering colonel and what he assumed was an inexperienced female soldier had transformed into something else entirely. Colonel Hawthorne turned back to face her, and the look in his eyes had changed completely. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something that might have been fear or respect or both. "You can sit down now, Colonel," Maria said quietly, "unless you still want that demonstration." For the first time since this encounter began, Hawthorne seemed to fully grasp what he was dealing with. This wasn't some desk jockey who had been promoted beyond her abilities. This was a warrior, someone who had seen and done things that would give him nightmares. No, he stammered. "No, I think we're good here." But Maria wasn't finished. She had spent too many years having her qualifications questioned, had endured too many superior officers who assumed her small stature and gender made her incompetent. This was an opportunity to set the record straight once and for all. "Actually, sir, I think we should finish what we started," she said, her voice still calm but carrying an undertone of steel. "You wanted proof of my qualifications. You wanted to see if my techniques would work on someone who knew they were coming." She gestured to the space between them. "You're still welcome to test them." The challenge hung in the air, but now it carried completely different implications. This wasn't about proving herself to a skeptical superior officer anymore. This was about respect, about acknowledging that appearances could be deceiving, and about the dangerous assumptions people made. Hawthorne looked around the cafeteria, suddenly aware of how many people were watching, how many witnesses there were to his humiliation. Every soldier in that room now knew that he had tried to bully and intimidate someone whose service record made his own look ordinary by comparison. "Staff Sergeant," he began, his voice much quieter now, "I think perhaps I was hasty in my assessment." "Were you, sir?" Maria asked. "Because a few minutes ago you seemed quite certain that I was unqualified to train your soldiers. You seemed to think that my size and gender made me inherently inferior as a warrior." The words were spoken without anger, but they cut deep. Hawthorne had indeed made those assumptions, and now he was being forced to confront how wrong he had been. I made a mistake," he admitted reluctantly, but Maria wasn't ready to let him off that easily. She had a larger point to make, one that went beyond this single confrontation. "Colonel Hawthorne," Maria said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent cafeteria, "I want you to think about something. In the last 10 minutes, you've made assumptions about my capabilities, based on my appearance. You've questioned my qualifications without reviewing my service record. You've attempted to publicly humiliate me in front of enlisted personnel. And you've done all of this because I don't look like what you think a warrior should look like." She paused, letting her words sink in. The cafeteria remained absolutely silent, with dozens of soldiers hanging on every word. "Now imagine if I were an enemy combatant," she continued. "Imagine if you encountered me in a hostile situation and made the same assumptions. How do you think that would work out for you?" Hawthorne's face had gone from pale to red and back to pale again. He was beginning to understand that this wasn't just about his mistaken assumptions. It was about a fundamental flaw in his thinking that could get people killed in real combat situations. The enemy doesn't always look like what we expect. Maria went on. "Some of the most dangerous fighters I've encountered in my career have been people who looked harmless, who seemed weak or ineffective, who used their opponent's assumptions against them. In Kandahar, I watched a Taliban operative who couldn't have weighed more than 120 pounds take down 3 experienced soldiers because they underestimated her. In Syria, I saw a teenager who looked like he should have been in high school eliminate an entire patrol because they didn't see him as a threat." She began to pace slowly, and there was something about her movement that reminded everyone watching that they were in the presence of someone who had seen real combat, real violence, real death. "You know what the most dangerous thing in combat is, Colonel. It's not the enemy you can see coming. It's not the obvious threats, the big guys with the heavy weapons. It's the ones you don't take seriously. It's the assumptions you make that get you killed. Sergeant Morrison nodded slowly. He'd served 2 tours in Afghanistan and had seen exactly what she was talking about. The enemy didn't always look like what Hollywood movies suggested, but this isn't just about combat, Maria continued. It's about leadership. It's about how we assess and develop talent within our own ranks. Every assumption you made about me today, that I was weak, inexperienced, unqualified, you've probably made about other soldiers under your command. How many capable warriors have you overlooked because they didn't fit your preconceived notions? How many talented soldiers have you failed to develop because you couldn't see past their appearance? The question hung heavy in the air. Several soldiers in the cafeteria were nodding thoughtfully, recognizing the truth in her words. They'd all seen good soldiers passed over for opportunities because they didn't look the part, or because some superior officer had made snap judgments based on superficial characteristics. Colonel Hawthorne was struggling to find his voice. This had gone far beyond what he'd expected when he decided to confront this woman. He'd thought he was going to make a point about standards and qualifications. Instead, he was receiving a master class in leadership and combat psychology from someone whose credentials far exceeded his own. "Staff Sergeant," he finally managed, I apologize. "You're right. I made assumptions that were both unprofessional and potentially dangerous." Maria nodded, accepting his apology but not letting him off the hook entirely. "The apology is appreciated, sir, but the real question is what you're going to do differently going forward, because this isn't an isolated incident, is it? You've made similar assumptions about other soldiers, other situations. The question is whether you're willing to examine those assumptions and change your approach." She gestured toward the soldiers watching the exchange. Every person in this room has been underestimated at some point in their career. Every one of them has probably had their capabilities questioned based on something other than their actual performance. As leaders, we have a responsibility to do better. Hawthorne looked around the cafeteria, seeing his soldiers with fresh eyes. There was Private Jackson, barely 18 and looking like he should still be in high school, but who had scored expert marksman on every weapons qualification. There was Sergeant Williams, who was shorter than most of the other soldiers, but who had a tactical mind that consistently impressed his superiors. There was Corporal Martinez, whose quiet demeanor disguised one of the sharpest analytical minds in the unit. How many times had he made assumptions about these soldiers? How many opportunities had he missed to properly develop their talents because he was looking for warriors who fit a certain mold? "You're absolutely right, Staff Sergeant," he said, and this time his voice carried genuine conviction rather than just embarrassment. "I have made those assumptions, and I need to do better." Maria could see that her message was getting through, not just to Hawthorne, but to many of the other soldiers listening. This had become about more than just one confrontation. It had become a teaching moment about leadership, about assumptions, and about the danger of judging capabilities based on appearances. "There's something else I want you to consider, Colonel," she said. "The soldiers you'll be sending to me for training, they're going to face real enemies who will use every advantage they can get. Those enemies won't fight fair. They won't limit themselves to opponents who look like traditional warriors. If your soldiers aren't prepared to face threats that come in all shapes and sizes, if they can't adapt their thinking beyond conventional expectations, then I'm not doing my job as their instructor." She moved closer to him, her voice dropping slightly, but still carrying to everyone in the room. "When I train your soldiers, I'm going to teach them to question their assumptions. I'm going to show them techniques developed by warriors who succeeded. Not because they were the biggest or the strongest, but because they were the smartest, the most adaptable, and the most underestimated. Is that going to be a problem for you?" Colonel Hawthorne stood there for a long moment, processing everything that had just transpired. The woman in front of him had not only demonstrated superior, Combat skills, but had delivered a lesson in leadership that cut to the core of his own shortcomings. The worst part was that she was absolutely right, and they both knew it. "No, Staff Sergeant," he said finally. "That won't be a problem. In fact, I think it's exactly what my soldiers need." Maria nodded, but she wasn't quite finished. There was more to this story, more that these soldiers needed to understand about the nature of modern warfare and the kinds of threats they might face. "Colonel, with your permission, I'd like to share something with your soldiers that might help them understand why this lesson is so important." Hawthorne gestured for her to continue, genuinely curious now about what other insights this remarkable woman might offer. Maria looked around the cafeteria, making eye contact with as many soldiers as possible before she began speaking. 3 years ago, I was part of a joint task force operating in a region I can't name, pursuing a target I can't identify. Intelligence suggested we were looking for a high-value enemy operative, someone responsible for coordinating attacks against coalition forces. Based on the intelligence reports, we expected to find a hardened male fighter, probably in his 30s or 40s, with extensive combat experience. The cafeteria had gone silent again, with every soldier leaning forward to catch her words. Stories from actual combat operations were rare and valuable, especially when told by someone with Maria's credentials. We tracked our target to a small compound in what appeared to be a civilian area. Standard procedure, we established surveillance, confirmed the target's presence, and planned our approach. Everything looked routine. She paused, her eyes taking on a distant look that suggested she was reliving memories that weren't entirely pleasant. When we breached the compound, we found our target exactly where intelligence said they would be. But instead of the grizzled veteran fighter we expected, we found a woman who couldn't have been more than 22 years old. She was small, probably no more than 5 feet tall, and she looked like she could have been somebody's daughter or sister. Several soldiers exchanged glances. They could see where this story was heading, but the details mattered. My team leader made the same kind of assumption that Colonel Hawthorne made about me today. He saw this young woman and decided she couldn't possibly be the dangerous operative we were looking for. He lowered his weapon slightly, started to question whether we had the right target. Maria's voice grew quieter, more intense. That moment of hesitation, that split second when he underestimated the threat based on appearance, nearly cost him his life. The woman had a concealed knife, and she moved faster than anyone expected. If not for my partner's quick reflexes, we would have lost our team leader to someone he didn't think looked dangerous enough to worry about. The impact of her words was visible on the faces around the room. This wasn't theoretical anymore. This was a real combat situation where assumptions had nearly proved fatal. It turned out that our target was exactly who we thought she was. A highly trained operative responsible for dozens of attacks against coalition forces. She had used her harmless appearance as a weapon, knowing that soldiers would underestimate her. She had killed experienced fighters who made the same mistake our team leader almost made. Sergeant Morrison was nodding grimly. He'd heard similar stories from other operators, tales of how the enemy adapted and evolved, using every possible advantage against coalition forces. The point is, Maria continued, the battlefield has changed. Our enemies have learned to exploit our assumptions, our biases, our preconceived notions about what a threat looks like. If we don't adapt our thinking, if we don't train our soldiers to see beyond appearances, we're setting them up to fail when it matters most. She turned back to Colonel Hawthorne. That's why your soldiers need this training, sir. Not just the physical techniques, but the mental preparation. They need to understand that their greatest enemy might not be the obvious threat, it might be their own assumptions. Hawthorne was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the full weight of what she'd shared. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a humility that hadn't been there before. Staff Sergeant Santos, I owe you more than just an apology. I owe you my thanks. You've taught me something today that could save lives, both my soldiers' lives and potentially my own." He looked around the cafeteria at his men, seeing them with new eyes. "I've been in the military for 23 years, he continued, "and I thought I understood what leadership meant. But you've shown me that real leadership isn't about maintaining old assumptions. It's about challenging them, questioning them, and being willing to learn from anyone who has something valuable to teach." Maria could see that her message was resonating not just with Hawthorne, but with soldiers throughout the room. Some were nodding thoughtfully. Others were clearly reconsidering their own biases and assumptions. "There's one more thing I want to share," she said, her voice taking on an even more serious tone. "The tattoos you saw on my back, they don't just represent qualifications and achievements. They represent teammates who didn't make it home. They represent missions where split-second decisions meant the difference between success and catastrophe. They represent lessons learned in the hardest possible way." The cafeteria fell silent again, the weight of her words settling over everyone present. "Every mark on my body tells a story about the price of assumptions, about what happens when you underestimate or overestimate a threat. I carry those reminders with me because in our line of work, forgetting those lessons can be fatal." She looked directly at Hawthorne again. "When I train your soldiers, Colonel, I'm not just teaching them techniques. I'm sharing lessons that were paid for with blood mine and that of better soldiers than I'll ever be. I hope you understand now why I take that responsibility seriously." Hawthorne straightened to attention, and Maria could see genuine respect in his eyes now. "I do understand, Staff Sergeant. And I want you to know that you have my full support for whatever training you feel these soldiers need. No questions, no interference, no assumptions about what they can or can't handle." Maria nodded, satisfied that her point had been made. But she had one final surprise for everyone present. "Actually, Colonel," Maria said, reaching into her pocket, "there's something else you should know before I begin training your soldiers." She pulled out a folded piece of paper and handed it to him. Hawthorne unfolded it carefully, his eyes scanning the official letterhead and dense text. As he read, his expression changed from curiosity to surprise to something approaching awe. "This is ... double quotes," he started, then stopped, reading the document again to make sure he wasn't mistaken. "A Medal of Honor citation," Maria said quietly. "Awarded for actions during a classified operation in 2018. I'm not supposed to talk about the specifics, but I can tell you that it involved extracting a captured pilot from behind enemy lines while under heavy fire." The paper in Hawthorne's hands was shaking slightly. The Medal of Honor was the highest military decoration awarded by the United States, reserved for service members who displayed extraordinary heroism in combat. In his 23 years of service, he had never personally met anyone who had received one. "Staff Sergeant," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I had no idea." "Most people don't," Maria replied. "I don't advertise it, and the circumstances of the award mean that most of the details remain classified. But I thought you should know before you make any more assumptions about my qualifications." Sergeant Morrison, who had been listening to this exchange with growing amazement, suddenly straightened up. "Wait a minute," he said. "Staff Sergeant Santos. Maria Santos ... Are you the soldier who—" He stopped himself, clearly remembering that he was treading into classified territory. Maria gave him a look that neither confirmed nor denied his suspicions, but her silence was answer enough. "Holy shit," Morrison breathed, then immediately looked embarrassed again for his language. Word began to spread through the cafeteria in whispers. Soldiers were pulling out phones, quietly searching for information about Medal of Honor recipients. Named Santos. While the details of her specific actions remained classified, the fact that she had received the nation's highest military honor was a matter of public record. Colonel Hawthorne was still staring at the citation, reading it over and over as if he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. When he finally looked up at Maria, There was something in his eyes that hadn't been there before, something that looked very much like reverence. "Staff Sergeant Santos," he said formally, "it would be my honor to have you train my soldiers. Any of them who don't treat you with the respect you deserve will answer to me personally." Maria nodded, accepting his words but also understanding that respect earned through revelation of awards and credentials, while better than no respect at all, wasn't the same as respect earned through demonstrated competence and character. "Thank you, Colonel. But I hope you understand that I didn't share this information to demand respect. I shared it to illustrate a point that's crucial for your soldiers' survival." She gestured around the cafeteria, where dozens of soldiers were still processing what they'd just learned. "The enemy doesn't care about your awards, your rank, or your reputation. They don't care if you're a Medal of Honor recipient or a fresh recruit. They're going to try to kill you based on opportunity and capability, not on what ribbons you wear on your chest." Her voice grew more intense, more focused. "But more importantly, you can't always tell who your allies are going to be either. In the field, you might find yourself depending on someone who doesn't look like your idea of a warrior. You might need to trust your life to someone who seems weak or inexperienced or different from what you expect." She moved closer to Hawthorne, her voice dropping but still carrying clearly through the silent room. 3 months from now, one of your soldiers might find themselves in a situation where their life depends on working with a local interpreter who's half their size. Or they might need to trust intelligence from a source who doesn't fit their expectations of what a reliable operative looks like. If I've taught them to look beyond appearances, to assess actual capabilities rather than making assumptions, I might save their lives. The lesson was crystal clear now, and everyone in that cafeteria understood it. This hadn't just been about one confrontation between a colonel and a staff sergeant. It had been about fundamental principles of survival, leadership, and combat effectiveness. On the flip side, Maria continued, they also need to understand that they themselves might be underestimated. That can be an advantage if they're smart about it, but it can also be dangerous if they're not prepared for the consequences. She looked around the room, making eye contact with several of the younger soldiers. "Some of you look young or small or inexperienced. The enemy might underestimate you the same way Colonel Hawthorne initially underestimated me. That can work in your favor if you're prepared for it, but it can also put you in situations where you have to prove yourself under fire." One of the younger soldiers, a private who looked like he was barely out of high school, raised his hand tentatively. "Staff Sergeant, how do you deal with constantly having to prove yourself? Doesn't it get exhausting?" Maria smiled, and for the first time since this encounter began, her expression softened slightly. "It does get exhausting, Private. But you know what I've learned? The people who matter, the soldiers who've been there, who've seen real combat, who understand what it takes to succeed in this profession, they don't need you to prove anything. They recognize competence when they see it." She gestured toward Sergeant Morrison, who nodded in agreement. "The people who demand that you constantly prove yourself, who judge you based on appearances rather than performance, are usually the ones who haven't been tested themselves. They're insecure about their own capabilities, so they try to make themselves feel better by diminishing others." The insight struck home with several soldiers in the room who had experienced exactly what she was describing. "But here's the thing," Maria continued. "Every time someone underestimates you, every time someone assumes you're not capable based on how you look or where you come from or what your background is, they're giving you information about themselves. They're showing you their weaknesses, their blind spots, their limitations." She turned back to Colonel Hawthorne, who was listening intently. "Colonel Hawthorne just gave me a master class in psychological warfare, though he didn't realize it at the time. He showed me exactly how he assesses threats, what his biases are, and how he makes tactical decisions. In a real combat situation, that information could be incredibly valuable." Hawthorne looked uncomfortable with this assessment, but he couldn't deny its accuracy. In his attempt to intimidate and belittle Maria, he had indeed revealed significant information about his own tactical thinking and decision-making processes. "You're saying I gave away operational intelligence without realizing it," he said. "Exactly," Maria confirmed. "And this is something all of your soldiers need to understand. Every interaction with a potential enemy is an intelligence-gathering opportunity. The way someone responds to pressure, the assumptions they make, the biases they reveal, all of that information can be weaponized." She began to pace again, her movement drawing everyone's attention as she shifted into full instructor mode. "Let me give you a concrete example. In 2017, I was part of a team tasked with infiltrating a compound controlled by a particularly nasty group of insurgents. Standard intelligence suggested we were dealing with traditional fighters men who would respond predictably to conventional military pressure. The soldiers in the cafeteria leaned forward, hungry for these real-world insights that might save their lives someday. But during our surveillance phase, we noticed something interesting. The compound's security was organized around protecting against threats that looked like us military-age males with obvious combat training. Their entire defensive posture was built around assumptions about what American soldiers would look like and how they would operate. Maria paused, letting the implications sink in. So we adapted our approach. Instead of a direct assault using our biggest, most obvious operators, we sent in our smallest team member first, a female operator who looked like she could have been a local civilian. She walked right through their security perimeter because they weren't looking for threats. That looked like her. Several soldiers nodded, beginning to understand the tactical applications of what she was describing. Once she was inside and had neutralized their communications, the rest of us moved in. The operation was successful because we understood their assumptions and used those assumptions against them. Colonel Hawthorne was following this closely, and Maria could see him making connections to his own tactical thinking. "But here's the crucial part," Maria continued. "If our female operator had looked like what those insurgents expected an American soldier to look like, if she had fit their preconceived notions about threats, the operation would have failed. Her effectiveness was directly tied to the fact that she didn't match their mental picture of what danger looked like." She stopped pacing and faced the room directly. "Now flip that scenario. Imagine you're the ones defending a position, and the enemy has studied your patterns, your assumptions, your biases. They know that you expect threats to look a certain way, to come from certain directions, to follow certain protocols. How do you think they're going to exploit that information?" The question hung in the air, and Maria could see several soldiers working through the implications. "They're going to send threats that don't match your expectations," Private Jackson said, his young voice carrying new understanding. "They're going to use our assumptions against us." "Exactly," Maria confirmed. "And this is why the training I'm going to provide isn't just about physical techniques. It's about mental preparation, about breaking down the cognitive frameworks that can get you killed." She moved closer to Colonel Hawthorne again. "Colonel, when you first approached me today, what were you thinking? What was your mental assessment of the threat I represented?" Hawthorne considered the question seriously. "I thought you represented no threat at all. I saw a small woman who probably had minimal combat experience, and I assumed I could intimidate you into backing down from a position I disagreed with. And what would have happened if I had been an actual enemy operative using the same psychological profile?" The realization hit him like a physical blow. "I would have walked right into a trap." "You would have walked right into a trap," Maria agreed. "And worse, you would have done it confidently, never suspecting that you were in danger until it was too late." The lesson was sinking in throughout the cafeteria. Soldiers were looking at each other with new eyes, reconsidering their own assumptions and biases. "This is advanced psychological warfare," Maria explained. "Understanding how people think, how they make assessments, how they categorize threats, and then using that understanding to your advantage. It's as important as marksmanship or tactics. And it's something most soldiers never receive formal training in. Sergeant Morrison raised his hand. Staff Sergeant, how do we train ourselves to recognize these blind spots? How do we avoid falling into these mental traps? It was an excellent question, and Maria could see that Morrison was thinking like a soldier who wanted to survive and help his teammates survive. First, you have to acknowledge that you have blind spots, she replied. Everyone does. The soldiers who get themselves killed are the ones who think they don't have any weaknesses or biases. She gestured around the room. Second, you practice constantly questioning your initial assessments. When you see someone, when you evaluate a situation, when you make a tactical decision, you force yourself to ask, what am I assuming? What if I'm wrong? What information am I missing? Several soldiers were nodding, already thinking about how to apply this approach. Third, you expose yourself to scenarios that challenge your preconceptions. You train with people who don't look like you, who don't think like you, who come from different backgrounds and have different approaches to problem solving. Maria looked directly at Colonel Hawthorne. This is why diversity in military units isn't just about fairness or politics. It's about tactical advantage. Teams that include different perspectives, different approaches, different ways of thinking are harder for enemies to predict and counter. The insight was striking several soldiers as particularly relevant. They'd heard diversity discussions before, but usually framed in terms of social justice rather than combat effectiveness. A unit composed entirely of soldiers who think alike, who make the same assumptions, who have the same blind spots, is a unit that can be easily exploited by a smart enemy, Maria continued. But a unit that includes different viewpoints, different approaches, different ways of assessing threats, that's a unit that's much harder to outmaneuver. This brings me to how I'm going to approach training your soldiers. Colonel, Maria said, her tone becoming more formal and instructional. Traditional military training focuses heavily on scenarios where the threat is obvious, where the enemy looks like what we expect enemies to look like, where the tactics follow predictable patterns. She moved to stand in front of the group. And suddenly everyone could see her, not just as the woman who had been challenged by their colonel, but as the instructor she would soon become for many of them. That kind of training has its place, but it's not sufficient for the realities of modern warfare. Your soldiers need to be prepared for enemies who don't follow the playbook, who use unconventional approaches, who exploit psychological as well as tactical vulnerabilities. Colonel Hawthorne was listening intently, and Maria could see that he was genuinely committed to learning from this experience. So my training program is going to include scenarios where nothing is what it seems, she continued. Exercises where the apparent threat is a decoy, where the real danger comes from an unexpected source, where success depends on questioning initial assumptions. Several soldiers exchanged glances, clearly wondering what they were getting themselves into. For example, Maria said, we might run an exercise where you're told to secure a building that contains a high-value target. But the person who looks like the target isn't actually the target, and the person who looks like a harmless civilian is actually the most dangerous person in the room. Private Jackson raised his hand. How do we tell the difference? How do we know who to trust? That's exactly the right question, Private. And the answer is that you learn to gather information before making assumptions. You observe behavior. Patterns, you look for inconsistencies. You pay attention to details that don't fit the expected profile. Maria began to outline specific training techniques, and the soldiers found themselves taking mental notes. We'll practice reading micro-expressions, understanding body language, recognizing the subtle signs that someone isn't who they appear to be. These are skills that intelligence operatives learn, but they're just as valuable for combat soldiers. She looked around the room, making sure everyone was following her explanation. We'll also practice being unpredictable yourselves. Learning how to project different personas, how to appear less threatening when that's tactically advantageous, how to use opponents' assumptions against them. Sergeant Morrison looked intrigued. You mean like acting? Like pretending to be someone we're not? Exactly like that, Maria confirmed. In certain situations, your ability to seem harmless, confused, or incompetent might be the difference between completing your mission and getting killed. These aren't just special operations skills. They're survival skills that every soldier can benefit from. The concept was clearly resonating with the soldiers, who were beginning to understand that warfare had evolved far beyond the traditional models they'd been trained for. But perhaps most importantly, Maria continued, we're going to practice recognizing and overcoming your own cognitive biases. We'll run exercises where your initial assessment is deliberately wrong, where the obvious choice is the wrong choice, where success requires you to think beyond your training. Colonel Hawthorne spoke up. Staff Sergeant, this sounds like it could be psychologically challenging for the soldiers. Are you concerned about the mental impact of constantly questioning their own judgment? It was a thoughtful question, and Maria appreciated that he was thinking about the welfare of his troops. That's a valid concern, Colonel, but I think the alternative is worse. A soldier who never questions their judgment is a soldier who's vulnerable to manipulation and deception. Better to challenge those assumptions in a controlled training environment than to have them fail in actual combat. She paused, considering how to explain this complex psychological concept. Think of it like stress inoculation. We expose soldiers to high-stress situations in training so they can perform under pressure in real combat. This is the same principle applied to cognitive challenges. We expose them to situations where their assumptions are wrong, so they can maintain flexibility and critical thinking when it matters most. The explanation made sense to the soldiers, who were familiar with the concept of stress inoculation from their physical training. Plus, Maria added with a slight smile, learning to think this way makes you better at everything, not just combat. It makes you a better leader, a better teammate, a better problem solver in general. She looked around the room, gauging the soldiers' reactions to what she'd outlined. I know this sounds more complex and challenging than traditional combat training, but the reality is that warfare has become more complex and challenging. Our enemies have adapted and evolved, and we need to do the same if we want to maintain our advantage. Several soldiers were nodding, clearly buying into her philosophy. The good news is that humans are incredibly adaptable. Your brains are wired to learn new patterns, to adjust to new challenges, to develop new capabilities. What I'm proposing isn't beyond your abilities, it's just different from what you're used to. Private Jackson raised his hand again. Staff Sergeant, when you were developing these skills, how long did it take? How do we know when we're getting better at this kind of thinking? Maria smiled at the question. That's the beauty of this kind of training, Private. You start seeing results almost immediately. Once you begin actively questioning your assumptions, once you start looking for inconsistencies and alternative explanations, you'll be surprised how much more you notice about the world around you. She gestured toward Colonel Hawthorne. In fact, you've all just had a master class in this kind of thinking. Look how much more information you have now about threat assessment, leadership dynamics, and cognitive biases than you had an hour ago. That learning process doesn't stop, it just gets more sophisticated as you practice. The soldiers were clearly engaged now, excited about the prospects of this new kind of training. But remember, Maria cautioned, these skills are tools, not magic. They require practice, attention, and constant refinement. And they don't replace traditional military skills, they enhance them. As the tension in the cafeteria finally began to dissipate, Maria could see that something fundamental had shifted. What had started as a confrontation based on prejudice and assumptions had transformed into a learning opportunity that would benefit everyone present. Colonel Hawthorne straightened his uniform and looked around at his soldiers with new eyes. The embarrassment of his initial approach was still there, but it was now overshadowed by genuine respect for what Maria had taught them all. "Staff Sergeant Santos," he said formally, "I want to personally apologize not just to you, but to every soldier in this room who has ever been judged based on appearances rather than capabilities. What happened here today has opened my eyes to some serious flaws in my own thinking." He paused, clearly struggling with the magnitude of his realization. "I've been in the military for over 2 decades, and I thought I understood what leadership meant, but you've shown me that real leadership requires constantly examining our own biases and assumptions. It requires being willing to learn from anyone who has something valuable to teach, regardless of what they look like or where they come from." Maria nodded, appreciating his willingness to acknowledge his mistakes publicly. "Colonel, what matters now isn't what happened in the past. What matters is how we move forward. Your soldiers are going to face challenges that require them to think differently, to assess threats differently, to work with allies who might not fit their expectations. If today's lesson helps prepare them for those challenges, then something positive will have come from this confrontation." She looked around the cafeteria, seeing faces that reflected a range of emotions: curiosity, respect, excitement, and perhaps a bit of apprehension about the training to come. "I want to be clear about something," Maria continued. "The skills I'm going to teach you aren't just military skills. They're life skills. The ability to question assumptions, to read people accurately, to adapt your approach based on new information. These capabilities will serve you long after you leave the military." Sergeant Morrison spoke up. "Staff Sergeant, after what we've seen today, I think I speak for a lot of us when I say we're looking forward to this training. When do we start?" Maria smiled. "Training starts now, Sergeant. Every interaction you have from this point forward is an opportunity to practice these skills. Pay attention to the assumptions you make about people. Notice when your initial assessments turn out to be wrong. Start questioning the mental shortcuts you use to categorize threats and allies." She gestured around the room. "Look at the soldiers sitting near you. How much do you really know about their capabilities? What assumptions have you made based on their appearance, their age, their background? Start there." The suggestion sparked immediate interest, and Maria could see soldiers looking at each other with fresh perspective. "And remember," she added, "this works both ways. Think about what assumptions others might be making about you. How can you use those assumptions to your advantage? How can you avoid being limited by other people's expectations?" Private Jackson, who had been asking thoughtful questions throughout this encounter, raised his hand again. "Staff Sergeant, what you've shown us today questioning assumptions, reading people, psychological tactics, do you think this is the future of military training?" It was an insightful question that got to the heart of how warfare was evolving. "I think it has to be private," Maria replied. "Our enemies are getting smarter, more adaptive, more creative in their approaches. They're studying us just as much as we're studying them, and they're finding ways to exploit our predictable patterns and assumptions." She moved closer to the group, her voice taking on a more urgent tone. "The soldiers who are going to succeed in future conflicts are the ones who can think flexibly, who can adapt quickly to changing circumstances, who can operate effectively even when nothing goes according to plan. Physical skills and traditional tactics are still important, but they're not sufficient by themselves." Colonel Hawthorne nodded thoughtfully. "It sounds like we need to fundamentally rethink how we prepare soldiers for combat." "Not just combat, sir," Maria corrected. "How we prepare them for leadership, for decision-making under pressure, for working with diverse teams and uncertain information. The skills we've been discussing today apply to every aspect of military service." She looked around at the soldiers one more time, seeing a group that was now genuinely engaged and eager to learn. "Here's what I want you to do between now and when formal training begins," she said. "Start paying attention to your own thought processes. When you meet someone new, notice what your brain immediately assumes about them. When you're presented with a problem, observe what solution you automatically gravitate toward. When you're in a stressful situation, watch how your assumptions might be limiting your options. The soldiers were clearly taking mental notes, understanding that their education had already begun. Most importantly, Maria concluded, remember that being wrong about your initial assessment isn't a failure, it's information. Every time you discover that your assumptions were incorrect, you're learning something valuable about how your mind works and how you can improve your decision-making. As soldiers began to finish their meals and prepare to return to their duties, the atmosphere in the cafeteria had completely transformed. What had started as a tense confrontation had become an impromptu masterclass in leadership, psychology, and adaptive thinking. Colonel Hawthorne approached Maria as the crowd began to disperse. "Staff Sergeant, I want you to know that you have my complete support for whatever training methods you think are necessary. After today, I trust your judgment completely." Maria extended her hand, and Hawthorne shook it with genuine respect. "Thank you, Colonel. I think your soldiers are going to surprise you with how quickly they adapt to these new approaches. They're good people with strong foundations. They just need to expand their toolkit." As she gathered her things and prepared to leave, Maria reflected on how the day had unfolded. She'd come to the cafeteria for a quiet lunch and ended up delivering an impromptu lesson that might save lives someday. But that was the nature of military service. You never knew when you'd be called upon to step up, to teach, to lead, or to demonstrate that appearances could be very deceiving indeed. 3 weeks later, the impact of that cafeteria confrontation was still reverberating throughout Fort Bragg. Word had spread, as word always does on military bases, about the colonel who had tried to intimidate a staff sergeant only to discover she was a Medal of Honor recipient with Ranger credentials. But more importantly, the story had evolved beyond just gossip. It had become a teaching tool. Colonel Hawthorne had done something that many officers in his position might not have had the courage to do. He had used his own mistake as a case study in leadership training. During his weekly officer meetings, he openly discussed what had happened, analyzing his own failures in judgment and the lessons that could be learned from them. "Gentlemen," he had told his staff during one such meeting, "I want to share with you the most humbling experience of my military career, and more importantly, the most educational." The story he told wasn't one that painted him in a flattering light, but it was one that served a crucial purpose. By acknowledging his errors publicly, he was modeling the kind of intellectual honesty and willingness to learn that he now expected from his subordinates. Meanwhile, Maria's reputation had spread throughout the base, but not in the way that might be expected. Rather than becoming known as the woman who had embarrassed a colonel, she was becoming known as an instructor who could teach soldiers to think differently about combat and leadership. Her first formal training session had taken place the Monday following the cafeteria incident, and word about her teaching methods had spread quickly through the ranks. Unlike traditional military instructors who focused primarily on physical techniques and established procedures, Maria challenged her students to question everything they thought they knew about warfare. "Forget what you think you know about how enemies behave," she had told her first class. "Forget your assumptions about what threats look like. Today, we're going to train your minds to be as adaptable as your bodies." The training exercises she designed were unlike anything the soldiers had experienced before. In one scenario, they were tasked with identifying the most dangerous person in a room full of apparent civilians. The obvious choices, the large, aggressive-looking men, turned out to be harmless actors, while the real threat was a quiet woman in the corner who looked like someone's grandmother. In another exercise, soldiers were required to gather intelligence from sources who didn't fit their expectations of what informants should look like. They quickly learned their most valuable information often came from the people they would normally overlook or dismiss. Sergeant Morrison, who had been Maria's unwilling demonstration partner in the cafeteria, had become one of her most enthusiastic advocates. During a conversation with fellow NCOs, he'd explained the impact of her training approach. "She's not just teaching us to fight differently," he'd said. "She's teaching us to think differently. And that's making us better soldiers across the board, better at reading situations, better at making decisions under pressure, better at working with people who don't fit our preconceived notions." The results were becoming apparent in ways that went far beyond combat training. Soldiers who had completed Maria's courses were showing improved performance in other areas as well. They were more effective at gathering intelligence, more successful at building relationships with local populations during exercises, and more adaptable when plans changed unexpectedly. Colonel Hawthorne had been monitoring these developments closely, and what he saw confirmed that Maria's approach was producing exactly the kind of warriors the modern military needed. But perhaps the most significant change was in the culture of the unit itself. The cafeteria confrontation had sparked conversations throughout the base about assumptions, biases, and the importance of looking beyond appearances. Soldiers were questioning their own preconceptions and challenging each other to think more critically about everything from tactical decisions to personnel evaluations. Private Jackson, who had asked such thoughtful questions during the original encounter, had emerged as an unofficial leader in these discussions. Despite his youth and inexperience, his willingness to challenge conventional thinking had earned him respect from more senior soldiers. "I used to think that being a good soldier meant following orders and mastering established procedures," he had told a group of his peers. "But Staff Sergeant Santos taught us that being a great soldier means being able to adapt, to think critically, and to question assumptions, even your own." The impact wasn't limited to enlisted personnel. Other officers throughout the base had begun seeking out Colonel Hawthorne's insights about leadership and the importance of checking one's own biases. What had started as a personal humiliation had evolved into an opportunity for broader institutional learning. Maria herself was somewhat surprised by how quickly and thoroughly her message had resonated throughout the base. She had expected some resistance to her unconventional approach, but instead found herself increasingly in demand as a trainer and speaker. The base commander had requested a private briefing about her training methods, and there was talk of expanding her program to other units. Military education specialists from other installations were asking to observe her classes and learn about her techniques. But for Maria, the most rewarding aspect of this entire experience was seeing the individual transformations in her students. Soldiers who had once made snap judgments based on appearances were now taking time to gather information before making assessments. Leaders who had previously relied on their own assumptions were now actively seeking diverse perspectives before making decisions. The ripple effects extended beyond the military context as well. Soldiers were reporting that the skills they learned in Maria's classes were improving their relationships with family members, making them more effective in civilian jobs they held on weekends, and helping them navigate complex social situations with greater awareness and sensitivity. One particularly striking example involved Sergeant Williams, a quiet soldier who had often been overlooked for leadership opportunities because he didn't fit the traditional mold of what commanders expected leaders to look like. After completing Maria's training and demonstrating his analytical capabilities, he had been selected for promotion and given responsibility for training new recruits. "Staff Sergeant Santos didn't just teach us about combat," Williams had explained to his new trainees. "She taught us about seeing people, really seeing them for who they are rather than who we assume they are. That skill will make you better soldiers, but more importantly, it will make you better human beings." The transformation wasn't universal, of course. Some soldiers and officers remained skeptical of approaches that challenged traditional military thinking. But even among the skeptics, there was growing recognition that the skills Maria was teaching were producing measurable improvements in performance and readiness. 6 months after the cafeteria confrontation that had changed everything. The effects of Maria's teaching were being felt far beyond Fort Bragg. Military education specialists from across the armed forces had come to observe her training methods, and similar programs were being pilot tested at bases around the world. The Pentagon had taken notice of the improved performance metrics coming out of units that had implemented Maria's cognitive training approaches. Soldiers who had completed her programs were showing significantly better results in complex scenario-based exercises, improved ability to work with diverse teams, and enhanced decision-making capabilities under pressure. But the story had also attracted attention outside military circles. Leadership consultants in the corporate world were studying Maria's methods, recognizing that the same cognitive biases that could prove fatal in combat were also limiting effectiveness in business. Environments. Harvard Business School had invited Maria to speak at a conference on adaptive leadership. Tech companies were incorporating elements of her bias recognition training into their hiring and management processes. Law enforcement agencies were exploring how her techniques for reading people and situations could improve officer safety and community relations. The transformation was particularly striking when observed through the lens of Colonel Hawthorne's own journey. The officer who had once dismissed Maria based on her appearance had become one of the military's most vocal advocates for diverse perspectives and cognitive flexibility in leadership. During a recent interview with Military Leadership Quarterly, Hawthorne had been remarkably candid about his evolution. 6 months ago, I thought I knew what effective military leadership looked like. I had a mental template based on decades of experience, and I was confident in my ability to assess soldiers' capabilities quickly and accurately. Staff Sergeant Santos taught me that my confidence was actually a weakness, that my certainty was blinding me to possibilities I'd never considered. He had gone on to describe how questioning his own assumptions had made him not just a better leader, but a more effective strategist and decision-maker. Now, when I'm evaluating a situation or making personnel decisions, I force myself to ask, what am I assuming? What if I'm wrong? What perspectives am I missing? It's made me slower to judge but faster to adapt, and that's proven invaluable in both training and operational contexts. The data supported his observations. Units under Hawthorne's command were showing improved performance across multiple metrics. More importantly, they were demonstrating the kind of flexible thinking that military leaders recognized as essential for future conflicts. Maria herself had been promoted to Master Sergeant and given broader responsibilities for developing training curricula. Her methods were being codified into formal military education programs, ensuring that future generations of soldiers would learn these cognitive skills as part of their basic training. But she remained focused on the individual soldiers she worked with directly, understanding that real change happened one person at a time. Every soldier who learns to question their assumptions, to look beyond appearances, to think flexibly about problems, that's a victory, she had explained during a recent training session. Not just for the military, but for society as a whole. These soldiers will carry these skills into their civilian lives, into their communities, into their roles as parents and leaders. The ripple effects were indeed extending into civilian contexts in unexpected ways. Veterans who had completed Maria's training were reporting improved relationships with family members, better performance in civilian jobs, and enhanced ability to navigate complex social situations. One particularly compelling example involved a veteran named David Chun, who had struggled with civilian employment after leaving the military. Traditional veteran job training programs had focused on translating military skills into civilian equivalents, but Chun had found it difficult to adapt to corporate environments where the rules seemed unclear and constantly changing. After completing Maria's cognitive flexibility training, Chun had approached his job search differently. Instead of trying to fit himself into predefined roles, he had focused on identifying organizations that valued adaptive thinking and diverse perspectives. He had landed a position with a consulting firm that specialized in helping companies navigate complex, uncertain business environments. Staff Sergeant Santos taught me that being different from what people expect isn't a disadvantage, it's a strategic advantage, Chun had explained. The same thinking that made me a better soldier made me a better consultant. I bring perspectives that my colleagues don't have, and that makes our team stronger. Similar stories were emerging from veterans across the country. The skills Maria had developed for military contexts were proving remarkably transferable to civilian challenges. Educational institutions were also taking notice. Several universities had begun incorporating elements of bias recognition and cognitive flexibility training into their leadership and business programs. High schools were experimenting with curricula designed to help students question assumptions and think more critically about complex problems. The broader social implications were significant. In an era of increasing polarization and tribal thinking, Maria's approach offered a framework for bridging divides and finding common ground. By teaching people to recognize their own biases and question their assumptions, her methods were creating space for more nuanced, productive conversations about difficult topics. Civil rights organizations had begun studying her work, recognizing its potential for addressing systemic discrimination and prejudice. If people could be trained to recognize and overcome their unconscious biases in military contexts, the same principles might be applicable to civilian interactions involving race, gender, religion, and other identity markers. Law enforcement agencies were particularly interested in these applications. Police departments across the country were grappling with issues of implicit bias and community relations, and Maria's training methods offered a practical approach to improving officer decision-making in high-stress situations. Several pilot programs were underway, teaching officers to recognize their assumptions about threats and to gather more information before making critical decisions. Early results suggested that officers who completed the training were less likely to escalate situations unnecessarily and more effective at building rapport with community members. The medical field was also exploring applications of Maria's methods. Emergency room physicians and surgeons were learning to recognize how their assumptions about patients, based on appearance, behavior, or background, might be affecting their diagnostic and treatment decisions. Studies had shown that cognitive biases in medical settings could literally be matters of life and death, with certain patient populations receiving different levels of care based on healthcare providers' unconscious assumptions. Maria's training offered a systematic approach to addressing these disparities. As Maria reflected on the year that had passed since that fateful confrontation in the Fort Bragg cafeteria, she was struck by how a single moment of standing up for herself had spiraled into something much larger than anyone could have anticipated. The small woman who had been dismissed and underestimated by Colonel Hawthorne had become a catalyst for fundamental changes in how the military and increasingly civilian organizations thought about leadership, decision-making, and human potential. But for Maria, the most meaningful transformations were still the individual ones she witnessed in her daily work with soldiers. Just that morning, she had received a letter from Private Jackson, who was now Specialist Jackson, and serving with distinction in a leadership role that would have been unimaginable for someone his age under the old system of assumptions and preconceptions. Dear Staff Sergeant Santos, the letter had read, I wanted you to know that the lessons you taught us that day in the cafeteria probably saved my life last month. During a patrol in a training exercise, I encountered a situation where every instinct told me to respond one way, but I remembered what you said about questioning assumptions. I took an extra moment to gather information, and it turned out the obvious threat was a decoy. The real danger was coming from a direction I would never have considered if I hadn't learned to think beyond my initial assessment. Stories like Jackson's were becoming commonplace, but they never lost their impact on Maria. Each one represented validation that the principles she had fought to establish were making a real difference in the lives of the soldiers she served. Broader institutional changes were significant as well. The military's approach to training and leadership development had shifted markedly toward emphasizing cognitive flexibility, bias recognition, and adaptive thinking. These weren't supplementary skills anymore. They were core competencies that every soldier was expected to develop. Colonel Hawthorne, who had become an unlikely ally and advocate, was now leading efforts to integrate these approaches throughout the Army's officer training programs. His personal transformation from skeptic to champion had made him a powerful voice for change within military leadership circles. "What Staff Sergeant Santos taught me," he had said during a recent address to newly commissioned officers, "is that our greatest strength as military leaders isn't our ability to impose our will or our vision on others. It's our ability to recognize when our vision is incomplete, when our assumptions are wrong, and when we need to learn from people who see the world differently than we do." The speech had been widely circulated and had become required viewing for officer candidates across all service branches, but perhaps the most significant long-term impact was cultural. The military, an institution not traditionally known for rapid change or questioning of established hierarchies, was evolving into an organization that valued intellectual humility and cognitive diversity alongside traditional military virtues. Younger soldiers entering the service were finding an environment that encouraged them to think critically, to challenge assumptions constructively, and to contribute perspectives that might differ from conventional military thinking. This was producing a generation of military leaders who were more adaptable, more creative, and more effective at navigating complex, uncertain environments. The civilian applications continued to expand as well. Corporate leadership training programs, educational curricula, and even conflict resolution processes were incorporating elements of Maria's approach to bias recognition and cognitive flexibility. International military organizations had also taken notice. NATO training programs were adopting similar methodologies, recognizing that modern warfare required soldiers who could think flexibly across cultural and tactical boundaries. Maria had been invited to speak at conferences around the world, sharing her insights with military leaders, educators, and business executives. But she remained most comfortable in the training environment, working directly with soldiers who were eager to expand their capabilities. During a recent training session, she had been asked by a young soldier whether she ever regretted the confrontation that had started it all. "Do you ever wish Colonel Hawthorne hadn't challenged you that day?" the soldier had asked. "Your life would probably be a lot simpler if that whole thing had never happened." Maria had considered the question thoughtfully before responding. "I think about that sometimes," she had admitted. That confrontation was uncomfortable and embarrassing for everyone involved. It would have been easier to just back down, to avoid the conflict, to let his assumptions go unchallenged. She had paused, looking around at the soldiers who were hanging on her every word. "But then I think about all of you and all the soldiers who will come after you, and I realize that sometimes the most important thing you can do is stand up and be counted. Not because it's easy or comfortable, but because it's necessary." Her voice had grown more intense as she continued. "Every time someone challenges unfair assumptions, every time someone refuses to be diminished by other people's limitations, every time someone stands up and says, 'I am more than what you see,' that person is making it easier for the next person to do the same thing." The lesson had resonated deeply with her students, many of whom had faced similar challenges of being underestimated or dismissed based on their appearance, background, or other superficial characteristics. As Maria looked toward the future, she could see that the work was far from finished. Changing institutional cultures and individual mindsets was a long-term project that would require sustained effort from many people over many years, but the foundation had been laid, and the momentum was building. The small woman with the ranger tattoo had proven that appearances could indeed be deceiving, and in doing so, had opened up possibilities that none of them had imagined when this all began with a simple confrontation over lunch in a military cafeteria. The lesson was clear. Never underestimate anyone, because you never know who might change your entire perspective on what's possible. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.